Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid. Welcome to the new week, the Monday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It is an absolutely gorgeous day overhead. However, it's quite chilly out, very windy and cold. And after the warm weather we've had, the cold seems to be a little bit more biting than it usually is. I hope the weather is as good as it is here where you are. I know that there are some parts of the country that continue to have real weather issues. Welcome to another week of the Virtual Center. Today is Monday, the 21st day of March in the year 2016, and it is a pleasure to be with you. Before we went on the air, Bob mentioned that we were having a little bit of technical difficulties. We probably wouldn't have the lead-in music, and I kind of shrugged my shoulders and said, that's fine. But I actually missed it. And no offense, Bob, but I kind of did. I really missed the regular intro. I hope that your weekend as well went well. I hope that all's well with you as we continue to fumble our way through this very, very interesting, intriguing election season. We spent quite a bit of time in our last program talking about Donald Trump and the issue of authoritarianism, and I thought that we might begin today's program with just a little bit of an overview or review of that, and kind of pick up where we left off. But if that issue was one that you felt that you wanted to make a comment on, I wanted to remind you, as we do every day, that we do have a phone line that is reserved for you to share your thoughts, your ideas, your concerns, your suggestions with our audience here at the Virtual Center. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. And of course, as we've said many times, 4676 on your phone keypad translates into HORN. And again, I do remind you, by mentioning that, I do remind you that to keep in mind and continue to do all you can do to support the Head On Radio Network and keep programs like this and like the other programs that are presented here on the Horn, on the air. I think it's very important as we move through this election season. It's becoming very, very important that we have an alternative point of view here. It's beginning to look, as we look at the election season, it's beginning to look like the major networks are really not handling all this well. I'm noticing some evidence coming out of the Bernie Sanders campaign that indicates that there's serious concern about whether, in fact, Bernie Sanders is getting a fair shake from the networks in terms of coverage and all the rest of it. And, of course, we continue to have the back and forth that goes on in the Republican Party. So, again, I do hope that you will do all that you can do to keep programs like this one and the others on the Head On Radio Network on the air. If you're kind of reluctant to be on the air, but you'd like to offer a thought or a concern or a suggestion or an idea or whatever you whatever that might be, we would love to hear from you. You can send me an email. And if it seems worthy, if it seems to be something that our listeners ought to be aware of, I will, protecting your anonymity, of course, I will presume the right to try to get your idea on the air for you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, all one word, lowercase, @gmail.com. And finally, I call your attention to the fact that for the last several months, we have had a Facebook page devoted to the Virtual Center. If you go to Facebook, to the homepage, and you type in under the search box, the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution, you will be into our Facebook page. And there are a number of opinion pieces on there, which I trust you will find interesting. I hope you will. And what I do want to mention here is that if you are inclined to respond to any of those, whether it be positive, whether it be negative, whether it be additions, subtractions, suggestions, whatever you might be that is based on what's on that page, I encourage you to avail yourself of the opportunity to react, whether it's on the air with a phone call, whether it's using the email address with an email to me, or whether in fact you choose to comment in the place provided on Facebook itself. However you respond, I would be very, very appreciative of hearing from you on these particular issues. Again, I don't want to take a lot of time to mention something we've mentioned numerous times before, but obviously the value of what we try to do here at the Virtual Center is increased many-fold the more interaction that there is. So I want you to know that I do look forward to and I welcome your comments and your suggestions, your concerns, criticisms, whatever they might be, because I think they offer all of us the opportunity to expand our understanding, expand our horizons, and actually, from an intellectual perspective, grow a little bit. And that's really what I think what all of us are about. I mentioned a few moments ago about the elections and the tone of violence that seems to be the hot issue over the weekend within the Republican primaries. Rachel Maddow on MSNBC had a fairly extensive statement the other night on the violence associated with the Donald Trump campaign. And what she and her staff was successful in doing was building chronologically the Trump rallies going all the way back to the very beginning in Iowa, New Hampshire, into South Carolina, et cetera, and showing how there's a tone or an undercurrent of this idea of violence from the very beginning, and how that idea, that germ, if you will, seems to grow as the rallies go on. And she points out, and I think the comment itself is telling. She points out that it's not an accident, in her view, that the culmination of violence happened in the three places that it did, namely Cleveland, St. Louis, and then that evening in Chicago. And she points out that those are the three major cities in which adolescent black males have been shot by police officers in recent months. And basically what she's pointing out is the idea that if you, as the speaker, encourage violence or seem to be encouraging violence, and violence does indeed happen, then the question becomes one of liability or responsibility. Donald Trump has insisted throughout of washing his hands on this whole thing and saying, basically, I'm just pointing out facts and I have no control over what the people who hear me might say. The fact of the matter is, there is, it seems to me, an inherent level of responsibility here. And I think it's not a worthwhile defense to claim that violence was not your intent. I've mentioned this in other venues before, and I'll just mention it quickly because I don't want to take the bulk of our program on this issue. Unless you do, if you have a comment, by all means, feel free to pick up the phone and give us a call or come on the air, and we'll pursue this further. But communication theory, one of the realities of communication theory, those who really look at the issues of communication, interpersonal communication, media, and broadcast responsibilities, have pretty well concluded that intent on the part of a speaker is not really the driving issue. Rather, it's the message received, not the message intended, that really carries the weight. In other words, if the people listening to you or reading your written words conclude from what they read or what they hear that there's an advocacy of violence inherent in the message, then for the speaker or the writer to claim that that was not the intent, that there was no violent intent associated with this at all, seems to me, at least when you look at the theory from the point of view of the experts, a rather weak argument. That ultimately the origin of the words is responsible for the reaction to those words. And if there is a note of violence encouraged, then it seems to me that there's an element of responsibility associated with it. And again, I don't want to take a lot of time on this, but I think it's very, very important. One of the things that has fascinated me throughout, and especially in the last several days, is the issue of party itself. We've been back and forth, off and on, in and out for a number of months, looking at the nature of America's two-party system. We spent quite a bit of time on it several weeks ago, looking specifically at the issue of responsibility versus non-responsibility in our two-party system. And it seems to me that one of the things that I've been focusing on more than anything over the last several days is what is the impact of what's currently going on, especially in the Republican primary. What is or is likely to be the overall impact on the nature of America's two-party system? Much of the attention, much of the media's attention in recent days is focused principally, it seems to me, on the future of the Republican Party given what's happening. Given the fact that for all practical purposes, Donald Trump is so far ahead that there is some question as to what will happen should he come close but not achieve the magic number of 1,237 pledged delegates prior to the convention, the Cleveland Convention in July. Trump has said, and I know many of you have been focusing on this, Donald Trump said very clearly that if he comes within 50 votes, or even 100 votes, of the magic number of 1,237, and the party finds a way within the convention to deny him the nomination, he expressed concern that those who support him will riot, that violence will be the outcome. The way he presented this was from the perspective of a serious concern that he has. But the fact of the matter is, most people see this as a veiled threat. That what Donald Trump seems to be doing in mentioning the possibility of violence should the nomination be denied him is really, in a sense, blackmailing the leaders of the Republican Party. And what is happening, of course, is that many prominent Republicans are desperately seeking an alternative to Donald Trump for fear that if he does indeed get the nomination, the Republican Party is liable to experience a horrendous loss in the fall elections. The concern of many Republicans is not so much the White House, interestingly enough, it's loss of the Senate. Because there's only, I believe, 4 seats that have to change hands in this fall election in order to deny the Republican Party the majority in the Senate and give it back to the Democrats. So that's a concern with a Trump victory, with the Trump nomination. And so the question is there another option? And of course, Ted Cruz is doing everything he can to paint himself as the only viable option to Donald Trump because he's won several of the Republican primaries. He's beaten Donald Trump several times, and he continues to make that point. And the fact of the matter is, in recent days, a number of prominent Republicans have, some of them reluctantly, have fallen into line and endorsed Ted Cruz as their choice, as their alternative to Donald Trump. One of the last ones, and one of the most prominent, is Mitt Romney. The thinking was that if Mitt Romney did commit to a candidate, it would almost have to be John Kasich. Because Kasich is the moderate alternative to Donald Trump. Mitt Romney ran as a moderate conservative in the last election. And so the assumption is that if he did endorse a candidate, it would clearly be Kasich. But the fact of the matter is, Mitt Romney himself has said that his number one objective is to deny Donald Trump the nomination. And that means he's got to throw his support to whomever he believes can win. And in his view, Ted Cruz is the only one with a chance to secure the nomination if it's not going to go to Donald Trump. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, also threw his support to Ted Cruz for essentially the same reasons. And as we know, when Lindsey Graham was an active candidate, he made some pretty disparaging remarks about Ted Cruz. And it surprised a lot of people that in spite of those remarks, he would endorse Ted Cruz. All of this seems to me to speak to the degree to which these people are insistent that Donald Trump not be the nominee. One thing that I think is significant, I heard one of the commentators make this point, and it seems to me really worth mentioning again. The difference between Donald Trump and Ted Cruz from the perspective of these Republicans who are endorsing one or the other candidate. There seems to be a sense among prominent Republicans that many of them really aren't much more fond of Ted Cruz than they are of Donald Trump. The difference is the future, in their minds, I guess, the difference seems to be the future of the party. Many prominent Republicans believe that if Donald Trump does indeed secure the nomination, the Republican Party as we know it, the Republican Party as the voice of conservatism in America, will be gone. And that ultimately what will be necessary will be the creation of a totally new second party within our two-party system. The thinking amongst many of these folks is that if Ted Cruz wins the nomination, he too, they believe, is likely to lose in the fall to the presumptive Democratic candidate, Hillary Clinton. The difference is that these people don't believe that Cruz's damage to the party will be irreparable. They believe that Donald Trump, with the nomination, will effectively destroy the Republican Party as it currently exists. They don't necessarily see that happening with Cruz. In other words, they believe that even if they lose the election with Cruz, they stand a better chance of retaining the Senate than they do should Donald Trump get the nomination, and that the damage to the Republican Party is liable to be less. It's one of the most unbelievable political situations that one can imagine. In other words, all of these people, prominent people, acting from a series of negative choices. I don't want to do this, but I have to do it in order to make sure that that doesn't happen. In other words, all the positives of two-party politics seem to be missing, seem to be gone. And many people are being faced with horrendous, from their perspective, horrendous negative choices. I think it's fascinating. But even more fascinating for me, philosophically, is the whole issue of two-party politics within this context. And it seems to me almost essential that we begin to retrace our steps a little bit and begin to look at the nature and some of the considerations that have gone into the structure of our two-party system in American politics. And that's what I would really propose to do for the bulk of our program today. Is in many cases review things that we've touched upon before. But I think you'll find that there are a number of issues and a number of considerations included here, which many of us may not have heard before. I've been doing quite a bit of reading, quite a bit of research in recent days and weeks in the nature of two-party politics, because I believe that this is something I really have to do some writing about. I've been looking at many of our programs over the previous months and years now. We've been on more than 3 years. And I think we've touched on a lot of issues that I believe can contribute to people's understanding of the nature of our American political systems as the founders envisioned it. The one thing that we haven't really gone into in the kind of depth that is necessary, it seems to me, is the nature of our two-party system. One of the issues which makes that difficult, one of the problems with the two-party system in this context, is that the two-party system is not mentioned in the Constitution, in the debates over the Constitution, except in a negative context. The issue of parties at the time of the debate over the Constitution was universally agreed to be negative. Most of the founders were very skeptical and very suspicious of parties. They wanted to do everything possible to discourage parties. And part of the reason for that is, and this we've touched upon many times before, is that most people in the 17th and 18th century, when they used the word party, really meant faction. They really meant interest group. They really meant an organization of individuals primarily devoted to the satisfaction of self-interest, of private interest. And so, as Madison pointed out in Federalist number 10, factions as such are sown into the nature of man. They are natural. We can't do anything about them. They're an evil that we need to learn to live with, seems to be Madison's overall message. But it's not only Madison. If you read Washington, if you read Jefferson, it's very clear that self-interested parties or factions, many of these people believed, would tear the political fabric apart at the very time when the priority needs to be bringing it together. The whole nature of Republican government, of popular government, is to enable the masses of the people to come together to participate in the process of making political decisions. And the thinking is, and I think most of us would agree that this is pretty valid thinking, the thinking is that in order for the masses of people to come together and participate constructively, that's pretty well going to require that people agree on many of the basics. That there need to be basic bottom line positions of agreement amongst all different peoples. And once you have that, once there's a general agreement in the overall objectives as to what we want, what this republic is and ought to be about, then the details of making that work is where the mass involvement and mass participation takes place. The real danger in a republic, in a popular government, many of these folks believe, is when there are such basic elements of disagreement and discord that literally the issue on the table is the republic itself. The danger is that when the differences between groups become so heated and so divided and so emotional and so ideological, not susceptible to compromise, then the danger is that you're going to tear the political fabric apart to the point that it will be impossible to put it back together again. So the thinking is that in order for Republican government to work, there needs to be these basic elements, basic tenets of agreement. And we spent, and not recently, but it's been several months ago, we spent quite a bit of time talking about the basic elements or assumptions that drove Republican government. The idea, for example, that Republican government is popular government. That there needs to be a mechanism, a way for the masses of people to participate in the political process. To deny people access to the process is to raise the issue of whether in fact these people will support the process. In other words, the thinking is that the value of Republican government is that people will support and endorse and defend a political system which they feel they in part own. If they have a role in making the law, in making the rules, then they are much more likely to live according to those rules, to abide by those rules, to do what they're supposed to do. That's the basic premise, it seems to me, of republicanism. But the difference between republicanism and pure democracy is the difference in terms of power. In a Republican government, decisions are made not by the majority, not by the people, but by the representatives of the people. In other words, the people elect representatives to act in their name. That's the participation. And Madison said in one of the Federalist Papers that when the people are given the right to participate in the choice of their representatives, then you have Republican government. The idea or the ideology behind republicanism was pretty much grounded in the writings of Montesquieu and his Spirit of the Laws. The idea that given the demand, the necessity of mass participation in political decision making, and given the fact that the final decisions would be rendered by the representatives of the people, then the only way that Republican government can work is when there is a back and forth reciprocal relationship between the people and their representatives. If there is no communication between people, between citizens and their elected representatives, then the representatives become autocrats. They become somewhat dictatorial because they are making decisions in the name of the people without consulting the people. Montesquieu believed that the only way republicanism can work is when the people are given the opportunity to actively participate, to actively express their ideas, their principles, their vision, their ideals to the representatives. That means they need to know who their representative is. That means they need to be able to communicate with their representatives as much as possible. And that in turn means that in order for a republic to be successful, it must be small. It must be small enough in area that the people are likely to know who their representative is and to be able to communicate with that representative. And from the other perspective, it needs to be small enough so that the representative can know his constituents, and I use the word his advisedly. Obviously, we're not talking about women here. We're talking exclusively about men. It's vital that the representative know his constituents, know their wants, their desires, their needs, and be able to speak in behalf of his constituents. And it's only when that back and forth reciprocal relationship between citizens and representatives is functioning that Republican government can work. That's the ideal. There's nothing within this framework, within this ideological context, that even suggests the legitimacy of political parties. The assumption is that if the elements of agreement amongst all the people are strong enough and popular enough to keep people functioning together and living together in peace and harmony, then the worst thing that can happen to that situation would be a party that was advocating something else, a faction, an interest group that was organized for its own self-interest against the interests of the majority, the interests of the community as a whole. So up and down the line, parties were considered to be negatives. We know in our political system today, the idea of America's two-party system is intended to build consensus and to build unity within a diverse population. In other words, the nature of parties today are not ideologically narrow. On the contrary, they are ideologically diverse. In a winner-take-all election situation, the party that wins control of government is the party that can appeal to the majority of the voters. And in a diverse, heterogeneous population with a variety of different interests, then the only way to win a majority is to be moderate in the positions one takes rather than to be doctrinaire and specific. By definition, if there are a variety of different opinions on different issues within the district or within the nation as a whole, then the only way to win a majority is to find a way not so much to appeal to all of those different groups, because in some cases they're so diverse that by appealing to one, you automatically alienate the other one. The political strategy that works is to avoid taking definitive positions on issues that are controversial, because the realization is clear that if you come down and take a clear position on a particular issue, and if that issue is controversial, you automatically alienate everybody who doesn't abide or subscribe to that position. And so by definition, the successful candidate is the one that can walk both sides of the fence on some of the most controversial or divisive issues. You come down for all the right things. You come down against all the wrong things. They're the givens. Everybody's for peace. Everybody's for clean air. Everybody's for a healthy economy. Everybody's for jobs. Everybody's for education. Everybody believes in the importance of health and nutrition. Everybody believes in the importance of parenting and raising your children properly and all the rest of it. In other words, there are certain givens in society that nobody takes issue with. But then, as we know, there are many issues that come up in society that are controversial, that are divisive. Religion is one. Guns is another. Same-sex marriage is another. Abortion is another. taxes is another. In other words, there are certain issues that if you come down too clearly for a particular view of that issue, you run the risk of alienating all the people who are opposed to it, to that position. So the way that you win majorities is by walking a very moderate course toward the middle, rather than allowing your campaign or your perspective to be drawn too far toward one way or too far in the other direction. And so that's the nature of our modern two-party political system. The fact of the matter is then, a major change must have occurred at some point in our nation's history to produce that kind of change in the nature of party. How did political parties go from the worst thing in the world in the 17th and 18th century to a consensus builder by the time you get into the middle of the 19th century, and especially in the 20th century? How did our political party system go from being the biggest threat to political unity in our country to the major asset that promoted that unity, that consensus, that togetherness, that sense of agreement? That's the issue. Richard Hofstadter, who's one of the leading authorities on the nature of America's two-party system, makes the comment that the idea of a party system which brings people together and builds consensus, promotes negotiation, promotes dialogue, promotes compromise, is a pretty sophisticated phenomenon. It's pretty shrewd. So the question, it seems to me, is how did it develop? Why did it develop? A few months ago, we spent quite a bit of time, I think a whole hour of a program, on Richard Hofstadter's book, The Idea of a Party System. And as I recall, we spent an entire hour on the title of the book, because it is so important. The idea of a party system. The key words there being idea and system. If you just look at the word idea, the idea of a party system, the implication is that somehow party system, if it's a positive idea, promises the solution to a problem. In other words, in Hofstadter's book title, The Idea of a Political System, there is in that title the inference that Hofstadter recognizes before you even get into the first page of the book, that party as a phenomenon is a problem in a republic. Because by definition, party implies division. It implies differences of opinion. It implies discord. It implies controversy. So when Hofstadter talks about the idea of a political system, what he's implying is that if Madison is correct, if parties are sown into the nature of man, if free peoples naturally disagree about this, that, and the other thing, if divisions within society are natural, then the implication is that somehow the concept, the idea of a system can fix that. Hofstadter's title implies the reality that a sophisticated political system will not only make parties acceptable, but in fact will render them absolutely necessary to our republican system. And that's where we get into the idea or the concept of political party as system. The idea that it is a definitive, understandable institutional process. And that by definition, it has rules. It operates according to certain givens, certain standards, or certain principles. And when it functions as it's organized to function, in other words, when it becomes an operative system, it fixes the problem that parties inherently pose, namely division and discord. The implication is that the idea of a party system in Hofstadter's mind is the transition of America's parties from divisive institutions designed to create discord and division into a functioning political system that is designed to unite, to bring people together, to build consensus, or to create or promote compromise. In other words, the whole nature of party is transposed 180 degrees from threat to a necessary asset. Hofstadter's subtitle, The Rise of Legitimate Opposition in the United States, 1780 to 1840. What Hofstadter's book seeks to do is to treat the development of party in America's first 60 years after independence is one. From 1780 to 1840, in order to build the idea of what he calls legitimate opposition, the so-called loyal opposition, the idea that differences of opinion can be good, that if properly managed, they can become consensus builders rather than society's dividers. That's basically, I think, the value of Hofstadter's book. And I think we focused on this the last time we dealt with this book. In his title page, so to speak, after the preface and the table of contents, if I'm not mistaken, right after the preface, Hofstadter includes a rhyme written by Thomas Babington Macaulay, the noted English historian, about party. And Macaulay wrote the following: Then none was for a party. Then all were for the state. Then the great man helped the poor, and the poor man loved the great. Let me repeat that. Then none was for a party. Then all were for the state. Then the great man helped the poor, and the poor man loved the great. The implication of Macaulay's rhyme, Macaulay's poem, so to speak, is that the organization of a well-organized state, nation, is based upon the fact that everybody agrees on basic principles. That there is real community, there is a real sense of unity within the body politic. People buy into the same truths. And the degree to which that happens determines or measures the strength of your state. If everybody supports the state, it's because they believe the state governs in behalf of all the people. There's no division, there's no rich versus poor, or city versus country, or merchants versus farmers, or blacks versus white, or northerners versus southerners, or Christians versus non-Christians. None of that. The implication is that the ideal state functions on behalf of everybody and treats everybody relatively the same. That's the ideal. That's the goal. And Macaulay says, when that happens, when that is true, there's no party, there's only the state. And if that's true, the wealthy take care of the poor naturally, and the poor support the wealthy. The basic hostility between rich and poor that divides all societies doesn't exist. What I point to you is that is an ideal. That is an ideal which many philosophers and many ideologues aim to achieve. What James Madison wrote in Federalist Number 10 about factions being sown into the nature of man pretty much speaks to the fact that Macaulay's poem is an ideal which never can be realized. Madison believes that factions, by definition, are natural. You can't get rid of them. They're always there. People disagree about this, that, and everything. So Madison's position in the Constitution of the United States is you gotta deal with the reality of factions because they're always there. That's party. So in effect, what Madison is saying in Federalist Number 10 in the Constitution of the United States is that you cannot govern a republic according to the theory of Macaulay because it's an ideal that you'll never attain. You'll never reach it. Consequently, Madison says, you gotta deal with the realities of factions, of parties. And Madison said there are two ways to deal with parties. One is to eliminate them. The other is to control them. In other words, find a way that parties don't exist. Find a way that you can create what Macaulay is writing about. The ideal community where the rich care for the poor support the rich. There's no room for party. There's only the state. That's the idea. That's the ideal. Madison says if you seek to create the ideal, then there are only two ways to do it. Either you got to make everybody the same. You got to somehow guarantee that everybody believes and wants the same things. In other words, you got to brainwash your population so everybody thinks the same. Or you've got to make it impossible for people to join parties. In other words, you need to outlaw factions. You need to make them illegal. And Madison points out that the only way you can eliminate factions is to take away people's freedom to belong to them. That's the only chance you got. So Madison's conclusion is that you cannot eliminate the causes of factions. You cannot create Macaulay's ideal state, because you can't take away people's freedom, and you can't brainwash everybody to want the same and believe the same things. Both of those are impossible. Therefore, Madison concludes, you cannot eliminate the causes of faction. What you have to do instead is find a way to control their effects. Find a way to deal with the realities of faction, but find a way to structure the government in such a way that factions cannot gain enough power to impose their self-interest over the best interests of everybody else. And then Madison goes into the definition of factions. And if you recall, Madison said a faction can either be a majority or a minority of the people. If a faction is a majority of the people, that means that the majority of the people are able to put aside all the things that divide them in order to unite around the one thing that unites them. And Madison tells us that that one thing is property, wealth, or lack of it. In any society, Madison is assuming, the major division that causes factions is the division between those who have property and those who don't, the rich and the poor. And in that scenario, the poor are always the majority. So Madison's conclusion in Federalist number 10, if you're going to control the effects of factions, the only way to do it is make sure that the majority can never get power, because their overriding commitment or sense of unity to the fact that they are poor will override everything else. And so Madison's argument seems to be that the only way to prevent the majority from seizing power is to emphasize the things that divide them rather than the things that unite them. It's absolutely fantastic logic on Madison's part. Basically, Madison's reality, or the difference between Madison and many of the others at this time, is that most of the people during this period believed that Macaulay's ideal state was possible. That if you organize your state properly, you could somehow create a humane state in which everybody was treated the same and everybody would support the state and there would be no need for factions or divisions. Madison believes that that is a farce, that that is impossible. Madison believes that factions are with us. There's nothing we can do about them. You can't get rid of them. So the only thing you can do is make sure that they cannot get power. They cannot unite and affect their plans of oppression, as Madison says. And then the bulk of his Federalist 10 is the structure of government as outlined in the Constitution in order to make it impossible that factions, primarily the majority faction, can ever get control. And Madison says that's the value of the Republic. Because by allowing people to participate in the election of those who will represent them and speak for them and make decisions, you eliminate the problem of majority faction, and at the same time, you preserve the spirit and the form of popular government. And that, in a sense, is a summary of Madison's Federalist number 10. So I guess the point is, from the perspective of parties, Madison has come a long way from Macaulay and from many of the other people in his own period. Many people believe that parties are bad and you got to find a way to get rid of them. Madison has recognized that you can't get rid of them. And the only thing you can do is find a way to deal with them. And the Constitution that he drafts is designed to do that. What I'd like to do when we return for our second hour is look a little bit more carefully at some of the events and some of the happenings that caused the transition from parties being a dangerous thing into parties being a positive thing. And that's the idea of the party system that Richard Hofstadter is writing about. You're listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We have reached the top. We've actually gone a couple of minutes beyond the top of the hour. It's 3 minutes after the hour in the East. We're going to pause and take a 5-minute break, and then we'll come back and we'll complete our second hour in today's program here at the Virtual Center. This is Bill O'Brien. We'll pause for a short break. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. My, do I miss that music. I didn't realize how important it is. It just seems like, just doesn't seem right, I guess.
Well, no, the music was there. You just didn't hear it.
Oh, okay. Did I miss good music?
Yeah, it was great music.
Oh, that's okay. That's even worse. Thanks, Bob.
My
I
pleasure.
appreciate it. Bye-bye. Thanks a lot. You're listening to the second hour of the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. If you're just joining us, I want to welcome you to today's program. And if you have been with us through the first hour, we've begun to deal with the issue of two parties once again. And I'd like to thank you for staying with us, and I hope that we can make our second hour worthy of your time. So thank you very much. And again, I want to make you aware of the strategies or the ways we have so that you can participate in the program more directly than merely being a listener. We have a phone number, as you know, and that phone number will get you directly on the air, so that you can share your ideas, your questions, your concerns, or whatever, not only with me, but with our other listeners. Our phone number is area code 304-663-4676. 304-663-4676. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's W-A-O'Brien, O-B-R-I-E-N, lowercase, all one word, 906@gmail.com. And again, I invite you to visit our Facebook page and to make your thoughts and your reactions to some of the opinion pieces that are on that page available. I've tried to put a number of pieces on there that are driven in large part by what we do here at the Virtual Center. Many of them are linked, obviously, to the political campaign that is currently underway in this nation, sometimes focusing on Republican debates and the Republican side of the ledger, other times focusing on the ongoing contest between Hillary Clinton and Senator Sanders, Bernie Sanders of Vermont. Our attention today has been focused on the two-party system, and if you are just joining us, right prior to the break at the top of the hour, we were talking about the very negative attitude that many of the founders, many of the people in the 18th century had towards parties. Part of the reason for that is that the ideal society in the minds, in the eyes, and in the hearts of many people was the society described by Macaulay in that little poem, where the state makes the rules, the state governs in behalf of all the people. There's no such thing as party. There's no need for party because everybody believes, supports, and wants the same things. And especially a society in which the wealthy care about the poor and the poor in turn support the wealthy. That's the ideal community. That's the ideal that everybody seeks. But as we pointed out, James Madison in the Constitution of the United States drafted the Constitution from the perspective that ideal was just that, an ideal and nothing more than that. Madison believed that parties, factions, are sewn into the nature of man. There's no way to get rid of them. The only thing you can do is find a way to control them, find a way to keep them from enforcing their will on the majority of the community, substituting their self-interest for the public interest. And Madison structures the whole Constitution with its separation of powers and checks and balances system as a way to bring that about. As he says in Federalist number 51, by countering ambition with ambition, by pitting branch against another branch, by pitting agency against agency, interest against interest, you basically create a situation of dysfunction in which no one group is able to successfully seize power over all the other groups. And as long as you can prevent that from happening, the idea is that you are preserving a stable society. That's the ideal. We talked a little bit about Richard Hofstadter's book, The Idea of a Party System, subtitled The Rise of Legitimate Opposition in the United States, 1780 to 1840. Hofstadter's book deals with the introduction into the American political system of a two-party system as a way to deal with the reality of factions or parties. Hofstadter points out that Madison is indeed correct, that there are always factions, there are always differences of opinion and disagreements among constituent groups within your society. Somehow, Madison says in Federalist number 10, since you can't eliminate the causes of factions because they're sown in the nature of man, you need to find a way to control their effects so they can never receive or achieve power. And Hofstadter's book title, The Idea of a Party System, is the mechanism that Americans came up with to do that. That somehow, in American politics, party changed meaning from something to be dreaded into something that was absolutely necessary in order to preserve stability and unity and order in our society. And in his subtitle, Hofstadter identifies what that something is. It's the idea of a legitimate opposition. The idea that there needs to be a place or an opportunity for those who disagree with policy to go, short of becoming an enemy to their own society. As long as you're operating on the ideal that everybody can be on the same page, Macaulay's poem, which we read in the first hour, that everybody agrees on everything, there's no need for party. One group cares for the other group supports the first group, in other words, talking about rich and poor. The rich take care of the poor support the rich. In other words, all the things that traditionally divide a society, Macaulay says, are missing in the ideal society. Madison obviously believes that that's an ideal and unattainable ideal. Madison believes and indeed operates on the assumption that parties are natural and you've got to find a way to control them. That way is the idea of a loyal opposition. In other words, Hofstadter believes, Madison doesn't believe this yet. Hofstadter believes that the introduction of the concept of loyal opposition becomes the mechanism whereby parties can function in such a way that they do not threaten the unity of society, but in fact they contribute to it. They shift from being a negative into becoming a positive good. All based on the idea of the loyal opposition. And I think I've made this particular argument before, but let me repeat it. And it's a little bit complicated, but I ask you to kind of go along with me and it'll make sense. If your goal is Macaulay's ideal state, if you are insistent that everybody agree on everything, then what happens to the person that doesn't agree with everything? What do you do with the people who disagree on this, that, or the other? If there's no place, legitimate place for them to go, then you are demanding that people either put aside their differences in favor of unity or leave the system. In other words, you're forcing dissenters to become enemies to society at large. You're driving people who disagree out of the system. That will destroy your system because you're creating enemies committed to changing your system. Hofstadter's book, The Idea of a Party System, is the story of the transition in American politics into the creation of a legitimate, standardized, institutionalized two-party system which can accommodate dissent, which accommodates disagreement. By creating a two-party system and regularly having those two parties compete with each other for the votes of the majority of the people, for control of the government, you were automatically creating a mechanism which controls the threat of dissent. You're creating a place within the system that dissenters can go, namely to the other party. You are making it unnecessary for these people to become enemies to their own system, to their own society. And so the idea is that both sides compete with each other for majority support. And since the majority is to be found toward the center, towards the middle of the political spectrum, you can't be too extreme right or too extreme left. Because if you are, you alienate everybody else. So the only way that you have a chance of securing a majority for your party is to aim your platform, your goals, or your agenda toward the center, toward the moderates. Thereby, if both parties are aiming toward the center, then by definition, that system pulls opinion in your society towards the center, towards the middle. It builds consensus. It builds moderation. It rewards moderation. It discourages extremism. Extremism can't win in our political system because our political system functions by majority votes. If you are too extreme, you do not have the possibility of securing majority support. The only way you can have a chance of gaining control of government is to moderate your extremism. We can think back in our political history to recent examples where this is true. You may recall that Richard Nixon, before he became a candidate for national office, was defeated for governor of California. You may remember that Ronald Reagan was defeated for governor of California. Those kinds of defeats would seem to spell the end, the political end, for those individuals, for those candidates on the national level. But we know that both of them were able to be elected, were successful in getting elected president. The way they were able to do it is to moderate their positions so both of them seemed more centrist. The same thing is true the other way. We know, for example, that in 1972, the Democratic Party experienced one of the biggest defeats in its history. Its candidate was George McGovern. McGovern's strength was his position against the Vietnam War. That's the way he was able to secure the nomination of the Democratic Party in 1972. But when it came to a national election, that one position of being opposed to Vietnam was in the minds of many people too extreme. Moderates would not support that kind of an extreme position on the Vietnam War. Moderates had only one option, one place to go, and that was to vote Republican. So the fact of the matter is that the Democratic Party and McGovern's extremism cost the Democratic Party a major defeat. In other words, it imposed on the Democratic Party a major defeat. I basically said that incorrectly. So what we find then throughout our political history is example after example of people whose positions may appear to be extreme, realizing that they had to moderate their positions and seem to be more mainstream in order to have a chance of securing a majority of the votes. And we know that there have been stories of candidates working very hard to downplay their conservatism or downplay their liberalism in order to appear more moderate. Because the reality is that the majority is in the center, is toward the center of the political spectrum. Thereby, for most of our history, political parties, our two-party system, has been able to bring people together. Now we need to look at what's happening in 2016. It's very obvious that the position taken by the National Republican Party with the election of Barack Obama in 2008 and then his re-election in 2012, and the refusal of Republicans to work with the Obama administration on almost anything, has created the kind of division and discord in our society which has rendered our two-party system all but pretty much dysfunctional. Political business in Washington, it seems to me, has been stymied. Budgets are not being passed. The government, on a couple of occasions, was shut down. Politics seem to not be working. And one of the ingredients of that dysfunction is the inherent belief by each party that the other party is a threat to the future of the United States. In other words, what is gone, what is missing, is the sense of basic unity and agreement that allows both parties to function together and work towards negotiation and compromise. The leaders of the parties, by suggesting that you need to support our party because the other party will destroy America. That kind of divisiveness, that kind of division, that kind of hostility renders our political system dysfunctional. It literally threatens to destroy the nature of American politics because it divides a society which needs to work all the time toward unity. Our society is different than many political societies throughout the world because for all practical purposes, our population, our nation, throughout its history has pretty much been populated by immigrants. By definition, the population of the United States has been divisive to begin with. In most states, in most nations, governments can operate on the assumption that their people are pretty much united. The French government, for example, can pretty much conclude that most of the people within the country speak French, buy into the history of France, and pretty much want the same kinds of things. In other words, government can come into office in France or Spain or Italy or Poland or Great Britain or anywhere else, believing that the bulk of the people are together. Government doesn't have to work to create unity, it's already there. The history of America is different. Our nation was populated principally by immigrants. By definition, our population is diverse. It contains a multiplicity of different nationalities, ethnic groups, religions, accents, races. So not only do rich and poor divide us, but a number of other elements in our society divide us as well. What that has meant then is that throughout our history, government has been forced to find ways to create unity that wasn't automatically there. It's automatically there in most other societies. It's not automatically there in this one. Government has to create it. when you have the kind of polarization and discord and division that exists in this country between our major parties today, you have a government that has made a decision to not work towards unity, but to consciously work against it, to exacerbate, to exaggerate the differences within our society, and to create a society of us versus them, good guys and bad guys, white hats and black hats, the forces of good and the forces of evil. When our two parties look at each other this way, the one mechanism that our society has created to build unity has become dysfunctional. I am suggesting that what is going on in our politics right now literally threatens the future of this republic, because it threatens to highlight and exacerbate, to exaggerate the differences between us rather than emphasizing the commonalities between us. Instead of government being a force to bring people together, our politics is becoming a force to divide us. And in so many ways, we are already divided. Northerners and Southerners, urbanites and rural residents, Christians and non-Christians, whites and blacks and Hispanics, men and women, but men and women in the context of feminists versus traditionalists. There are so many things in our society that divide us. When our political parties, our political leaders, choose to emphasize the differences between us and downplay the unity between us, it renders our political system potentially dysfunctional. What we are losing, and what's clearly being lost in this current election campaign, is the idea, the commitment to, and the support for the idea of a loyal opposition. The idea that dissent is good. The idea that dissenting, open opinion, freedom of speech, and freedom of the press creates and solicits different opinions which lead to improved decisions in the marketplace of ideas. In other words, all the values and all the principles which have allowed a diverse nation to grow into the most powerful nation on the face of the earth in the history of man, in large part has been because we have been able to overcome our divisions and build upon created unity. And the major vehicle for creating that unity has been our two-party system. And it is now rendered all but functional. It's almost dysfunctional. Where did this idea of a loyal opposition come from? Where did it emerge? Is there one person that came up with the idea? Well, the fact of the matter is, if you go back to England before the War for Independence, during the colonial period, you begin to find that the idea of the loyal opposition began in England. It began in large part in the 16th century reign, of Henry IV. Bolingbroke. The name Henry Bolingbroke. Bolingbroke is the first one in British history to make the case for the idea of a loyal opposition, a legitimate opposition. He called it, and it's lasted throughout, he called it the idea of the country party as opposed to the court party. His sense was that Parliament was pretty much dominated by the upper class, the elite, those who had position and reputation and influence. And the majority of the people were losing faith in their government. They found nothing to connect with their government. Bolingbroke's argument was that the creation or the existence of a permanent country party was a way to legitimize the discord that was emerging in Mother England. Bolingbroke wrote a book entitled On the Idea of a Patriot King. In it, he introduced the idea of a constant, permanent opposition between the party in power and the party out of power. However, if you read carefully, you begin to get a sense that Bolingbroke didn't go far as the concept should have gone. Because there seems to be implied in Bolingbroke the idea that once the opposition party successfully gained power, it became the party. In other words, what was missing in Bolingbroke's frame of reference was the idea that when the out party became the in party continued to function as the out party. What he seemed to see is the idea that by legitimizing the opposition, at some point in time, the opposition party would take over. And once it did, the process stopped. Because the good guys were in power, so to speak. It was not until the 18th century, in the writing of conservative Edmund Burke, where Burke was able to introduce the idea of a permanent opposition. The idea that discord and dissent and free speech on a permanent basis would lead to better decision making. In short, it seems to me, Burke lays the groundwork for what becomes Madison's thinking in the Constitution of the United States. I think that this is extremely important. Those who affect to head an opposition, Burke said, must be equal at least to those whom they oppose. In other words, the opposition must be considered, must be looked upon as legitimate. This is the idea that Madison is not quite able to fully accept at the time of the Constitution. He accepts the idea on the need to control the effects of factions. He accepts the idea of the need for an internal system of checks and balances in order to manage or control factions. But he really has not yet bought into the idea of the legitimate opposition. The idea that the system is strengthened when there is a legitimate permanent opposition opportunity for all of those who dissent. By creating the system that Hofstadter writes about, the nature of our two-party politics is able to contain and channel dissent in positive directions, rather than driving dissenters out of the system entirely. I want to share with you, I think, one of the major ironies of American politics. And that is that while we credit Madison in the Constitution of the United States for building the ingredients, the acceptance of party as a reality in our political system that we can't do anything about except to control the effects of party, Madison is not ready to go all the way as yet to the idea of legitimate opposition. One of the ironies that has mystified historians about Madison is the fact that the Madison of the 1780s, who drafts and writes in support of the Constitution of the United States, in the 90s becomes the leading organizer of an opposition party, the so-called Jeffersonian Republicans. There's no question that Madison, probably more than anybody else because of his key place in Congress under President Washington, is able to organize the opposition to the Hamilton Federalist Party, the opposition to Hamilton's programs and Hamilton's foreign policy, the pro-British, anti-French nature of American politics and American foreign policy in the 1790s. Madison is still adamantly opposed to the power of faction, but more specifically, he is opposed to the idea that factions are able to gain power. The reason, it seems to me, that Madison takes such a strong position against Hamilton on the first bank of the United States, Hamilton's proposal that Congress create a United States bank, is that Madison believes that a private corporation, a private institution like the United States Bank, would give Federalists advantage within the political system, which would disrupt the balance that the Constitution created. In 1791, on the 8th of February, in a speech Madison delivered to the Congress of the United States opposing the creation of a national bank, Madison says on the floor of Congress, quote, "A corporate charter creates an artificial person previously not existing in law and confers important civil rights and attributes which could not otherwise be claimed." Madison is opposed in 1791 to the creation of the United States Bank because the United States Bank is a corporation. It is a government-created corporation. It is, in Madison's words, an artificial person. All the stuff we're hearing today about corporate personhood, the idea under Citizens United that corporations are persons under the 14th Amendment and therefore are entitled to the rights that other persons have under the Bill of Rights. As early as 1791, Madison is arguing against this. He's against corporations because corporations are artificially created persons. And Madison sees danger because these are more powerful persons than human persons. In other words, these are creations, artificial persons with the power to acquire political power that individual persons do not have. Madison believes that the United States Bank, as a corporation, as an artificial person, will disrupt the balance created within America by the Constitution of the United States. In September of 1792, Madison writes an essay in the Papers of America entitled A Candid State of Parties, unquote. This appears in the National Gazette on the 26th of September, 1792. Madison is arguing that parties, factions that were so opposed under the Constitution of the United States now exist and threaten the balance and the unity of America. Madison believes that the Federalist Party under Hamilton, because of its support from President Washington, is an example of a faction able to seize political power which violates the balance of the Constitution of the United States. Madison sees Hamilton's Federalist Party as a threat to the unity of the United States because it implies political power in the hands of a faction. And Madison's opposed to it. Madison believes that Hamilton's Federalists are aiming to appeal principally to the rich, to the influence of money, and to the power of the military. And that's what he's afraid of. Madison writes, Government can be carried on only by the pageantry of rank, the influence of money and emoluments, and the terror of military force. Men of those sentiments must naturally wish to point the measures of government less to the interest of the many than of a few, and less to the reason of the many than to their weaknesses. Hoping perhaps in proportion to the ardor of their zeal, that by giving such a turn to the administration, the government itself may by degrees be narrowed into fewer hands and approximated to an hereditary form. They will be induced by the most obvious motives to strengthen themselves with the means of influence, particularly of the moneyed, which is the most active and insinuating influence. Madison sees the Federalist Party under Hamilton as being a threat to the constitutional fabric of the United States. Translation: the Democratic Party in 2016 sees the election of Donald Trump as being the destruction of the political system of the United States. The leadership of the Republican Party itself in 2016 sees the election of Donald Trump as the destruction of the political system of the United States. When one party sees the other party as a threat to the future of the nation, the two-party system as we know it is not working. factionalism has taken over for the idea of the loyal opposition. There is no loyal opposition anymore. Donald Trump throws dissenters out of his rallies, violently if necessary. The idea of free speech, open discussion, open debate, and discord is being discouraged. And the fact that these protesters exist in these rallies is causing violence. So the question, it seems to me, all of us need to ask, is the violence the fault of the protesters, or is the violence the fault of the Trumpites? Going back to Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, are the marches, the civil rights marches that Martin Luther King participated in, that promoted and produced violence in Birmingham and other places, is the violence the fault of the protesters, of the civil rights demonstrators, or is the violence the responsibility of those in society who don't want to exercise or allow the freedom of the protesters to protest? It seems to me that's the issue. There is no general acceptance of the idea of legitimate opposition at all. And that's Madison's position when he writes what he calls a candid state of parties in the National Gazette in September of 1792. In terms of foreign policy, in 1799, Madison writes the following under the title Foreign Influence in the Aurora General Advertiser on January 23rd, 1799. Money in all its shapes is influence. Our moneyed institutions consequently form another great engine of British influence. Our bank is a powerful one. Their capital belongs in great part to Britons or to proprietors interested in British connections. The proprietors choose the directors. The directors dispense the credit and favors of the banks. Every dependent on these, therefore, is a kind of vassal, owing homage to his pecuniary superiors, on pain of bankruptcy and ruin. Say, ye citizens of Philadelphia, have ye not all felt or seen this influence whenever bank directors have been canvassers for votes or subscriptions? In 1799, Madison is writing about the impact of the political influence of big money as a result of the passage, the creation of the United States Bank, which he tried to oppose in 1792. He obviously was unsuccessful. Hamilton was successful in getting the bank through the Congress of the United States. And in 1799, Madison is speaking to the political influence exerted by the money that is represented by that bank in the ability of the directors to become canvassers for votes or subscriptions. What's very clear then is that as late as 1799, Madison has not yet accepted the idea of the loyal opposition. Madison still sees the Federalist Party, the other party, as being a threat to the peace and security of the United States. Quite a bit later, in 1825, which actually is a year before his death. Thomas Jefferson, in a letter to William Giles, speaks also to the issue of parties, and specifically against the issues of big money. Jefferson in 1825, and remember, Jefferson ceases to be president in 1812. So this is 13 years after Jefferson leaves the presidency. He still has not accepted the idea of loyal opposition. Jefferson writes to Giles, "Perhaps consolidation becomes the fourth chapter of the next book of the Federalists' history." Consolidation. But from their younger recruits, who have nothing in them of the feelings or principles of 1776, now look to a single and splendid government of an aristocracy, founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations under the guise and cloak of their favored branches of manufacturers, navigation, and commerce, riding and ruling over the plundered plowmen and beggared yeomanry. This will be to them a next blessing to the monarchy of their first aim, and perhaps the surest stepping stone to it. In a letter to George Logan, Jefferson writes, "I hope we shall take warning from the example of England and crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed and corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country," unquote. The reason I mention these quotes, the reason I share these quotes with you, is because they are indications that well into the 19th century, up into the 1820s, neither Madison nor Jefferson as yet has accepted the philosophical principle of the loyal opposition. They still see the Federalist alliance with big money as being a threat to the peace and security of the United States. They do not accept the legitimacy of two parties. They obviously believe that the solutions to the solutions to America's problems is to eliminate the Federalists from power and replace them with Republicans. So from that perspective, that lack of genuine acceptance of the principle of loyal opposition, one must conclude that Madison and Jefferson still look upon parties the same way they did in the 18th century, as factions, as organized interest groups who are organizing to secure political power and advantage for themselves. So basically, what we have to conclude is that our modern two-party system, the one that Hofstadter writes about in The Idea of a Party System, is yet to come in 1825. It's going to happen. The transition is going to occur between 1825 and 1840. And that's going to be in the person of Andrew Jackson and the period of so-called Jacksonian democracy. And I'd like to maybe postpone until tomorrow a little bit of that issue and look at some of the transitions that occur in American two-party politics then. We've reached the end of our program today. It's 59 minutes after the hour. I want to thank you for your time on this Monday. I hope that you have a wonderful, wonderful day for the rest of the day and this evening. Be kind and safe to each other. We look forward to seeing you back here tomorrow. Remember, Tuesday, our program begins 1/2 hour later than on it does on Monday. We're beginning at 30 minutes after the hour, 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow. This is Bill O'Brien. Thank you so very much. Goodbye, and again, thank you.